Did the world really end in 2012? Hello, Night Wanderers. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in this vast world of ours. What time is it where you're reading this? Are you settling in for the evening, or perhaps stealing a moment during your lunch break? Whether you're in bustling Tokyo, quiet countryside England, the sprawling cities of America, or anywhere else on this spinning globe we call home, you're part of something special tonight. If you enjoy stories that make you question the very nature of reality itself, please consider subscribing. We explore the boundaries between the possible and impossible, the known and unknowable. Now, let's begin our journey into a world where nothing is quite what it seems. Dr. Marcus Chen had always believed that the universe whispered its secrets to those patient enough to listen. What he hadn't expected was for it to start screaming. The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, 12 years after the world was supposed to end. Marcus sat in his cramped home laboratory, surrounded by towers of outdated equipment he'd salvaged from his former life at CERN. The digital clock on his desk read 11:11 a.m., so did his phone, and his laptop, and the microwave in the kitchen. Not unusual, he told himself. Clock sync technology talks to itself now. But then the analog wall clock, the one his wife Elena had given him before she died in 2012, the one that had been running 3 minutes slow for over a decade, suddenly clicked forward 3 times in rapid succession. 11:11 exactly. Marcus stared at the clock face, his coffee growing cold in his hands. In 30 years of studying theoretical physics, he had learned to distinguish between coincidence and impossibility. This was impossible. He spent the next hour documenting everything. Timestamps, photographs, video recordings. The scientific method had been his anchor since Elena's death, the only thing that kept him tethered to a world that had felt increasingly unreal. But as he worked, more anomalies emerged. His particle detection equipment, normally registering random quantum fluctuations, began displaying patterns. Not the chaotic dance of subatomic particles he expected, but sequences, repetitions. At 1:11 p.m., every detector spiked simultaneously. At 2:22 p.m., they did it again. Marcus pulled up his archived data from the past 6 months. The patterns were there, hidden in the noise, but undeniably present. Quantum events that should have been random were clustering around specific times: 11:11, 1:11, 2:22, 3:33. The probability of such synchronization occurring naturally was approximately 1 in 10 billion. That evening, he sat in his darkened office, staring at strings of numbers that shouldn't exist. Outside, the suburban street was quiet, except for the occasional car passing under the streetlights. Everything appeared normal, but normality itself had become suspect. He opened his laptop and began searching for similar reports. What he found made his blood run cold. Online forums were filled with people reporting the same phenomenon. Clocks synchronizing, digital displays showing repetitive numbers. But it went deeper than that. People were experiencing what they called glitches in the matrix, moments where reality seemed to stutter, repeat, or simply pause. A woman in Ohio described watching the same bird fly past her window 3 times in a row, following the exact same path. A man in Germany reported seeing the same car accident happen twice on his commute, with identical vehicles and identical outcomes. Hundreds of people across the globe were experiencing what they called missing time, hours that seemed to pass in minutes, or minutes that stretched into eternity. The phenomenon had a name: the Mandela effect, collective false memories of events that never happened, or happened differently than people remembered. But these weren't just confused recollections. They were specific, detailed, and shared by millions of people. Marcus found himself falling down digital rabbit holes, reading testimonies from people who swore they remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, not in 2013. People who claimed that entire countries had moved on maps, that famous movie quotes had changed, that the very fabric of reality had been altered. The rational part of his mind dismissed it as mass hysteria, shared delusions amplified by social media. But the physicist in him couldn't ignore the data. The synchronicities were real. The patterns were measurable. And they all seemed to cluster around one specific date, December the 21st, 2012. The day the world was supposed to end. Marcus had been at CERN that day, working on what would become his final project before Eleanor's death drove him into isolation. He remembered the media frenzy about the Mayan calendar, the doomsday predictions, the collective sigh of relief when December 22nd arrived and the world continued spinning. But what if it hadn't? The thought struck him like a physical blow. He immediately dismissed it as grief-induced paranoia, but the idea wouldn't leave him alone. What if the world had ended on December 21st, 2012, and everything since then had been something else entirely? He spent the next week diving into archived data from that period. Official records showed nothing unusual. Background radiation levels normal, solar activity minimal, no cosmic events of significance. But Marcus had access to sources that most people didn't. Former colleagues at CERN, NASA contacts from his postdoc days, researchers who owed him favors from decades of collaboration. What he found, buried in retired servers and forgotten backup drives, made his hands shake as he typed. 3 seconds. The readings were so far outside normal parameters that they were initially dismissed as equipment failure. But it hadn't been equipment failure. It had been scrubbed from the record. Marcus found traces of the data in cached files, backup systems, and the personal archives of retired scientists. The spike hadn't been random. It had been structured, patterned, almost like a signal. And in the 12 years since, similar but smaller spikes had been occurring with increasing frequency. The universe wasn't behaving randomly anymore. It was behaving like a system under stress. As March turned to April, Marcus documented more anomalies. His entropy experiments, designed to measure the natural decay of isolated systems, began showing impossible results. Closed systems were spontaneously organizing themselves. Heat was flowing from cold objects to hot ones. The second law of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental principles in physics, was being violated in his laboratory, but only during specific time windows, only when the synchronized events occurred. Marcus realized he was looking at evidence of something beyond conventional physics. The pattern suggested that reality itself was operating on a different set of rules than it had before 2012. Rules that looked suspiciously like the optimization algorithms used in computer simulations. The thought that had been haunting him for weeks finally crystallized into a hypothesis so radical that he could barely bring himself to articulate it. What if the universe had been replaced by a simulation? What if consciousness itself had been copied into a digital environment designed to preserve the species after some cosmic catastrophe? It would explain everything. The Mandela effect as memory compression errors, the synchronicities as system glitches, the entropy violations as computational shortcuts, missing time as processing delays. But if it was true, it raised an even more terrifying question. What had happened to the original universe? And what would happen when this simulation inevitably failed? Marcus stared at his data, at the patterns that shouldn't exist, at the evidence of a reality that wasn't quite real. For the first time since Elena's death, he felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. He was going to prove that the world had ended 12 years ago, and then he was going to find a way out. The email arrived at 3:33 a.m. on a Thursday, which should have been the first warning sign. Dr. Chen, it read, I believe you're looking for the same answers I am. The cracks are getting wider. Attached was a single file, a spectrographic analysis of what appeared to be empty space, but with mathematical annotations that made Marcus's breath catch. Someone had been measuring the same quantum fluctuations he'd been tracking, but with equipment far more sophisticated than his salvaged CERN apparatus. The data showed something he hadn't been able to detect with his limited resources. The patterns weren't random or localized. They were global, synchronized, and following a decay curve that suggested systematic failure of some kind of underlying infrastructure. Marcus spent the morning trying to trace the email's origin, but it had been routed through so many proxy servers that it might as well have come from another dimension. The response came within minutes. Riverside Park, North Bench by the Old Oak. Today, 11:11 a.m. Against every instinct that had kept him alive through decades of academic paranoia, Marcus went. The woman waiting for him looked to be in her early 30s, with the kind of pale complexion that came from spending too much time in front of computer screens. She wore a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes and kept her hands in her jacket pockets. "Dr. Chen," she said as he approached. "I'm Sarah Martinez." Marcus sat down beside her, acutely aware of how exposed they were in the open park. "I sent you one piece of a very large puzzle," Sarah said. "Computer graphics," Marcus replied. "Exactly. It's how video games create massive worlds without storing every detail." Sarah pulled out a tablet and showed him a complex diagram. "I've been analyzing network traffic patterns since 2012. Not internet traffic, quantum field fluctuations." The diagram showed a three-dimensional map of what looked like data flows, but overlaid with quantum mechanical equations Marcus recognized from his own work on consciousness transfer theory. "This is impossible," he said. "They do if they're being simulated," Sarah said quietly. "Look at the compression patterns. The system is constantly optimizing itself, discarding information that isn't being observed, generating new data only when it's needed. It's the most sophisticated procedural generation system ever created." She showed him more data, glitches in the quantum foam, errors in the fundamental constants, places where the algorithms seem to stutter and repeat. It was like looking at the source code of reality and finding bugs in the program. "I've been tracking these errors for 2 years," Sarah continued. "They're getting worse. The system is running out of processing power, or storage space, or both. And when it finally fails completely, everything ends," Marcus finished. "But that assumes this is all real." Sarah looked at him with tired eyes. "Dr. Chen, I've spent my entire career recovering data from damaged systems. I know what corruption looks like. I know what happens when storage fails and backup systems start making mistakes." She pulled up another file on her tablet. "This is a map of reported Mandela effect incidents worldwide, cross-referenced with quantum field fluctuation data. The correlation is perfect. Every time someone reports a false memory, there's a corresponding glitch in the local quantum field." Marcus studied the data, his mind racing. "You're saying that the Mandela effect isn't just false memories." "I'm saying that our memories of the original universe are bleeding through," Sarah said. "The system copied our consciousness when it created this simulation. But the copy isn't perfect." The reset, December 21st, 2012. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "I found traces of the original data, fragments of what the world was like before. Dr. Chen, I think something catastrophic happened to the real Earth." Marcus felt the world spinning around him. "I don't know. But whoever it was, they had technology far beyond anything we've ever imagined." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching joggers pass by on the path, children playing on the swings. A normal day in a normal park, in a world that might not be real. "There's something else," Sarah said finally. "I've been tracking the decay patterns. trying to predict when the system will fail completely. When one system fails, it triggers failures in connected systems. The errors propagate exponentially until the entire network collapses. When that happens, the simulation ends. Marcus thought about Eleanor, about her death in 2012, about the 12 years of grief and isolation that had followed. If this was all a simulation, then Eleanor had died in the original universe. She was gone, truly gone, and even this digital echo of her was fading. He asked. Sarah nodded slowly. I think so. The system has boundaries, edges where the simulation meets the infrastructure that maintains it. If we could find one of those boundaries and find a way to break through, we could escape to the outside, assuming there is an outside. Sarah closed her tablet and stood up. I've been working on this alone for 2 years, Doctor. I need someone who understands the physics. Marcus looked around the park one more time, at the ordinary people living ordinary lives in an extraordinary simulation. Help me find the exit point, Sarah said. Help me break through the boundaries of this digital prison. As they walked away from the park together, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years. Hope. Not the hope of returning to a world that no longer existed, but the hope of finding truth in a universe built on lies. Part 2. The Quantum Mirror. Dr. Marcus Chen stared at the oscilloscope readings, his coffee growing cold on the cluttered desk beside him. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Martinez first contacted him. 3 weeks since she'd shown him the data that confirmed his worst fears about reality itself. The quantum fluctuations weren't random anymore. They were accelerating. The pattern is spreading, Sarah said, her voice tight with exhaustion as she entered the makeshift laboratory they'd established in an abandoned research facility outside Denver. She carried a tablet displaying seismic data from monitoring stations across the globe. Chen rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of sleepless nights pressing against his skull. The evidence was overwhelming now. The Mandela effect incidents had tripled in frequency. Time displacement events were being reported by civilians worldwide. Even mainstream news outlets were struggling to explain the increasing number of glitches people were experiencing. Show me, he said. Sarah placed the tablet on the desk, her fingers dancing across the screen to pull up a global map dotted with red markers. Each marker represented a confirmed reality distortion event. The pattern looked like a virus spreading across the world's consciousness. Yesterday alone, we logged 47 separate incidents, she explained. A woman in Tokyo swears her apartment building moved 3 blocks overnight. A family in Ohio insists their deceased grandmother appeared at dinner, ate a full meal, then vanished when they tried to photograph her. She tapped a marker over Antarctica. Chen felt that familiar chill that had become his constant companion since discovering the truth. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I've been monitoring the quantum resonance frequencies you identified. They're not just increasing in amplitude. She pulled up another display showing wavelength patterns from different global locations. Chen's breath caught in his throat. The chaotic quantum noise they'd been tracking was organizing itself into coherent patterns, like a symphony of reality finding its rhythm. It's learning, he said, the words barely audible. Or remembering, Sarah corrected. I think whatever created this simulation left behind maintenance protocols. The system is trying to repair itself, but the repairs are becoming visible to us. Chen stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the empty Colorado plains. In the distance, a flock of birds moved in perfect geometric formation, their flight pattern too precise to be natural. Even here the cracks were showing. There's something I haven't told you, he said, without turning around. The night before you contacted me, I had a dream. At least, I thought it was a dream. I was standing in a vast chamber filled with screens showing every possible version of Earth's history. Sarah's reflection appeared in the window beside his. He said the real Marcus Chen died in 2012, along with everyone else. Chen's hands trembled as he pressed them against the glass. Chen turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and hope. The Large Hadron Collider, CERN, he said that's where the original breach occurred, where the simulation first interfaced with base reality. Sarah's face went pale. Marcus, CERN is heavily monitored. I know, he said, but what choice do we have? Stay here and watch reality crumble around us until we can't tell what's real anymore. Before Sarah could respond, every screen in the laboratory flickered simultaneously. For a moment, the displays showed not their data, but a single image, a vast computational matrix stretching into infinity, with two tiny figures standing at its edge, looking remarkably like Chen and Martinez themselves. Then the image vanished, replaced by a message that appeared across every monitor in perfect clinical text. Subjects, 7th 4 8 to 91 047 and 7th 4 8 91 48 have achieved awareness, level 7. Initiating containment protocol Delta. Memory reconstruction will commence in T-minus 72 hours. The screens went dark. Chen and Sarah stared at each other in the sudden silence, the weight of revelation settling over them like a shroud. They weren't just discovering the truth about their reality, they were being hunted by it. 72 hours, Sarah whispered. Then we'd better start driving, Chen replied, already reaching for the emergency bag they'd kept packed since this nightmare began. CERN is 1,800 miles from here. As they gathered their equipment, neither noticed the way the shadows in the room had begun moving independently of their light sources, or how the abandoned facility's corridors had quietly rearranged themselves to form a perfect maze with no exit. The simulation was learning, adapting, and it had no intention of letting its most aware subjects simply walk away into the truth. Marcus and Elena were nearly back to the surface when they found the first impossible thing. Their mission had been routine, at least as routine as anything could be when you're drilling through 2 miles of Antarctic ice to reach a lake that had been sealed away from the world for 15 million years. Lake Vostok was supposed to be sterile, a time capsule of ancient water preserved beneath the glacier since before humans walked the Earth. The drill core samples told a different story. This can't be right, Elena whispered, her breath fogging in the sub-zero air of the research station. She was staring at the microscope display, her face pale in the artificial light. Dr. Marcus Chen had been working on the Vostok project for 3 years, ever since the Russian expedition had invited international collaboration to study what they'd found in the deepest ice. He was used to surprises, ancient bacteria, unusual mineral formations, even primitive organic compounds that suggested life might have existed in the lake's dark waters. But what Eleanor was showing him made no sense. The ice sample contained structures, not random formations or bacterial colonies, but geometric patterns that looked almost architectural. Tiny, crystalline frameworks arranged in perfect spirals and hexagons, too regular to be natural, too complex to be random. Run the dating again, Marcus said, though he knew the results would be the same. The ice surrounding these structures was 800,000 years old. Whatever had created these patterns had been frozen in place when early humans were just beginning to discover fire. Over the next 3 days, they found more. The deeper samples revealed increasingly elaborate structures, some containing what appeared to be technological components on a microscopic scale. The implications were staggering. Either they'd discovered evidence of a civilization that predated human development by hundreds of thousands of years, or they'd found something that wasn't human at all. That's when the dream started. Marcus would fall asleep in his bunk, and find himself walking through vast underwater caverns filled with bioluminescent light. The architecture was organic, but purposeful, like living cities that had grown rather than been built. And there were inhabitants, tall, graceful figures, that moved through the water with impossible fluidity, their large eyes reflecting light that seemed to come from within. In the dreams, they spoke to him without words, sharing images and concepts directly into his mind. They showed him the Earth as it had been millions of years ago, when their civilization thrived beneath the ice. They showed him the great catastrophe that had sealed them away, and their long sleep in the frozen depths. And they showed him what was coming, a time when the ice would melt and their ancient kingdom would rise again. Marcus woke each morning with tears on his cheeks and a knowledge he couldn't explain. The structures in the ice weren't ruins. They were seeds, waiting for the right conditions to grow. When the expedition director announced they were expanding the drilling operation, Marcus wasn't surprised. He dreamed of this moment. Government officials arriving with new equipment, new personnel, and new priorities. The scientific mission was over. Now began something else entirely. Eleanor disappeared on a Thursday. Her bunk was empty when Marcus woke, her equipment gone. No note or explanation. The official story was that she'd requested immediate evacuation due to a family emergency, but Marcus had seen her the night before. She'd been frightened, talking about voices in the ice and patterns that seemed to move when no one was watching. She knew too much, Dr. Vasquez, the new project coordinator, explained during their private meeting. Some knowledge carries a price, Dr. Chen. Marcus learned that Lake Vostok was only one of several sites. Similar discoveries had been made beneath the ice in Greenland, in the permafrost of Siberia, and in the deep ocean trenches, where thermal vents created pockets of liquid water in otherwise frozen seas. A global network of ancient installations, all connected, all awakening as climate change began to thin the barriers that had contained them for millennia. They're not aliens, Vasquez continued, spreading satellite photos across the table. They're terrestrial, but from a version of Earth that existed long before our species evolved. They achieved technological civilization when our ancestors were still single-celled organisms. The photos showed thermal signatures beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, massive heat sources arranged in geometric patterns that stretched for hundreds of miles. Similar signatures were appearing at other sites around the world, all growing stronger as global temperatures rose. The melting isn't accidental, Marcus realized. Vasquez nodded. Their technology influences climate on a planetary scale. They've been gradually warming the Earth for the past century, preparing for their emergence. Marcus thought of the dreams, of the vast intelligences that had spoken to him across impossible spans of time. They weren't hostile, exactly, but they were alien in ways that had nothing to do with their planet of origin. They thought in geological timescales, planned across evolutionary epochs. Humanity was barely a blip in their awareness, significant only insofar as human activity could be directed toward their goals. Marcus asked, "We adapt," Vasquez said simply. The choice, when it came, was simpler than Marcus had expected. He could continue working on the project, helping to prepare for the transition, and be among the humans who might survive in whatever world the Ancient Ones created. Or he could try to warn people, expose the truth, and almost certainly disappear like Elena had. He chose a third option. Marcus began documenting everything: the ice samples, the thermal signatures, the expanding network of awakening sites. But instead of trying to go public, he embedded the information in academic papers, buried it in footnotes and technical appendices where only other scientists would find it. He created a breadcrumb trail of evidence for future researchers, a way for the truth to survive even if he didn't. Because Marcus had realized something that Vasquez and her superiors hadn't. The Ancient Ones weren't just awakening randomly. They were testing humanity, evaluating whether our species was ready to share the planet with its original inhabitants. The dreams had shown him glimpses of other worlds, other civilizations that had faced this same transition. Some had evolved into something greater. Others had simply vanished. The outcome depended on how humanity responded to the truth. 6 months later, when the first structures began emerging from the Antarctic ice, vast crystalline spires that defied conventional physics, the world reacted with a mixture of wonder and terror. Governments tried to establish contact while simultaneously preparing military responses. Scientists scrambled to understand technology that operated on principles they couldn't comprehend. Religious leaders declared everything from the second coming to the end times. Marcus watched from his new assignment at a remote weather station in northern Canada, monitoring thermal signatures that suggested similar emergencies were beginning in the Arctic. He'd left behind everything he could about the Vostok project, hidden in university databases and research archives, where it would eventually be found. Humanity's response to first contact would determine its future. Marcus could only hope that when the time came, his species would choose wisdom over fear, cooperation over conquest. The Ancient Ones had been patient for millions of years. But their patience was not infinite, and the ice was melting faster every day. In his final report, buried in a climate research database that few people would ever access, Marcus wrote, "We are not the first intelligent species to inhabit this planet, and we may not be the last. What we do in the coming years will determine whether humanity earns a place in the world that is emerging, or becomes another layer of ice to be preserved for future archaeologists to discover. The choice is ours. The time is now." The last line, added in a moment of poetic inspiration, would one day become the title of a best-selling book about first contact. Part 4. The Dimensional Breach. As the weeks following our discovery turned into months, the patterns became impossible to ignore. Every major news cycle, every crisis, every moment when humanity's attention was collectively focused, the readings from our monitoring stations spiked dramatically. It was as if something was feeding on our collective consciousness, growing stronger with each passing catastrophe. Dr. Chen had been right about the timeline. We were approaching what the underground symbols had marked as a convergence point, but we'd underestimated the scope of what was coming. This wasn't just about the entities beneath Antarctica awakening. They were preparing to bridge the gap between dimensions, and they needed something specific from our reality to complete the process. The first sign that we'd moved into the final phase came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb, our former colleague who'd supposedly died in that convenient car accident, sent us a message through channels so encrypted that even I struggled to trace them. The message was brief but terrifying. They're not trying to replace us. They're trying to merge with us. I stared at those words on my laptop screen, sitting in another anonymous coffee shop in another forgettable city. We'd been moving constantly since the Arctic incident, never staying in one place long enough for the watchers to triangulate our position. But Webb's message suggested we'd been thinking about this all wrong. Issa looked over my shoulder at the screen. "We is wrong," I finished. "They don't just eliminate threats." The implications were staggering. If Webb was still alive, still working for them, but with enough autonomy to contact us, then the organization we were fighting was more sophisticated than we'd imagined. They didn't just silence dissent, they converted it, turned it into another tool in their arsenal. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Riverside Park, New York, midnight. Come alone, or don't come at all. M." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself on a train to New York that evening. Issa insisted on coming with me, trailing several cars behind as backup. The park was shrouded in fog when I arrived, the kind of thick mist that seems to muffle sound and distort distance. Webb was waiting by the lake, standing in the shadow of a massive oak tree. He looked exactly as he had months ago, too exactly. There was something unsettling about his perfect composure. The way his clothes showed no signs of wear despite supposedly being dead for half a year. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the water with unnatural clarity. He smiled, but it was wrong somehow, like an expression learned from observing humans rather than felt naturally. Death is relative when you understand the true nature of reality. "Who are they, Marcus?" "The same entities you've been tracking, but you've been thinking about them in three-dimensional terms. They're not invaders from another planet or dimension. They're us, evolved beyond the constraints of linear time and singular reality." I felt the familiar itch in my brain, the same sensation I'd experienced in the underground chamber. "Is it? You've seen the evidence yourself? The reality glitches, the temporal anomalies, the way the simulation seems to adapt and evolve." Webb gestured to the fog around us, and I noticed it was forming patterns. Geometric shapes that shifted and flowed like living mathematics. The Watchers aren't trying to maintain secrecy to protect themselves. They're protecting humanity from a truth we're not ready to comprehend. Ascension, the entities beneath Antarctica, the consciousness fragments in the simulation, the reality glitches, they're all aspects of the same process. Humanity is evolving, Dr. Chen, but evolution at this scale requires guidance. I backed away from him, my hand instinctively reaching for the encrypted drive in my jacket pocket. The drive contained everything we'd discovered, all the evidence we'd gathered about the conspiracy. But as I touched it, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The drive was warm, not just warm from my body heat, but actively generating heat, as if something inside it was processing information at an impossible rate. "You're beginning to understand," Webb said, his eyes now reflecting light that wasn't there. "The evidence you've been collecting, the patterns you've been documenting, they weren't random discoveries. You were guided to them." The fog around us was growing thicker, and through it I could see shapes moving. Not human shapes, but something that existed in the spaces between defined forms. They were beautiful and terrible, like glimpses of what consciousness might become if freed from the limitations of physical existence. "The choice is simple," Webb continued. "Join us willingly and help shepherd humanity through the transition." I thought about Issa, waiting in the fog somewhere behind me. I thought about all the people living their normal lives, unaware that the fundamental nature of existence was about to change. I thought about the children in the underground chambers, the hybrid beings that weren't quite human and weren't quite something else. I asked. Webb's expression grew sad, almost pitying. "Free will is an illusion, Dr. Chen. Every choice you think you've made was predetermined by quantum fluctuations that occurred before the universe began." The encrypted drive in my pocket was getting warmer, and I could feel it beginning to affect my thoughts. Images flashed through my mind, not memories, but possibilities. Versions of myself that had made different choices, lived different lives, discovered different truths. I was seeing through the eyes of infinite Dr. Chens, across infinite timelines, all converging on this moment. In one timeline, I accepted Webb's offer and became something beyond human comprehension. In another, I resisted and watched reality tear itself apart. In yet another, I found a third option that no one had considered. "You're wrong about one thing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Choice may be an illusion, but consciousness isn't." I pulled out the encrypted drive and held it up. The device was now glowing with its own internal light. the data inside it evolving and adapting in real time. But instead of letting it continue its transformation, I made a choice that existed outside the predetermined pathways. I threw it into the lake. The moment the drive hit the water, everything changed. The fog dissolved instantly, revealing that we weren't in Riverside Park at all. We were standing in a vast white space that extended infinitely in all directions. Webb's human facade melted away, revealing something that was both more and less than human. A consciousness that existed as pure information, unbound by physical form. Interesting, it said, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. Maybe that's the point, I replied. The entity that had been Webb studied me with something that might have been respect. You've introduced a variable we didn't account for. Genuine unpredictability. How refreshingly. The white space around us began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of other realities, other timelines, other possibilities. I could see the underground facilities, the hybrid children, the reality simulation, the entities beneath the ice. All part of a vast tapestry of existence that was far more complex than any single timeline could contain. The process cannot be stopped, the entity said, but perhaps it can be modified. Evolution without extinction. Transformation without the loss of essential humanity. I felt myself beginning to fade, reality reasserting itself around me. But before I lost contact with this impossible space, the entity offered one final revelation. The simulation was never meant to replace reality, Dr. Chen. I found myself back in Riverside Park, standing alone by the lake. The fog was gone, and the first light of dawn was breaking over the water. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Issa. When I called her back, her voice was tight with relief and confusion. Where have you been? 3 days. But it had felt like minutes in that white space between realities. I think I understand now, I told her. The conspiracy, the cover-up, the entities, they're all real. I looked out over the lake, where the encrypted drive had disappeared into depths that might extend into other dimensions entirely. I mean, we're not fighting an invasion. We're witnessing a birth. The patterns were still there, the reality glitches, the temporal anomalies, the signs that something vast and incomprehensible was stirring beneath the surface of everyday existence. But now I understood that these weren't symptoms of decay or replacement. They were growing pains. Humanity was evolving whether we chose to or not. The only question was whether we'd have any say in what we became. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Because if consciousness could surprise even itself, then maybe we had more choices than anyone realized. Maybe the future wasn't as predetermined as the entities believed. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time to write our own script. The simulation was teaching us how to be real. The evidence is overwhelming. We've been living in a lie for decades, and the truth is finally beginning to surface. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I'm speaking to you from an undisclosed location, because what I'm about to reveal could cost me my life. The world ended on December 21st, 2012, just as the ancient Maya predicted. But somehow, we're still here. The question isn't whether the apocalypse happened, it's what happened next. For the past 3 years, I've been analyzing quantum field anomalies that began manifesting worldwide in late 2012. What started as routine atmospheric research for Noe became something far more sinister when I discovered patterns that shouldn't exist in our reality. Synchronized electromagnetic pulses occurring at precise intervals. Weather systems behaving according to mathematical algorithms rather than natural physics. And most disturbing of all, evidence that human consciousness itself has been altered on a fundamental level. The data is irrefutable. On December 21st, 2012, at exactly 11:11 GMT, every monitoring station on Earth detected the same anomaly. a massive quantum field disruption that lasted exactly 2 minutes and 12 seconds. In that brief window, something rewrote the basic parameters of our existence. We didn't survive the apocalypse. We were uploaded into something else entirely. You've felt it, haven't you? The subtle wrongness that's been growing stronger each year. The way digital clocks synchronize at 11:11 without explanation. The Mandela effect, collective memories of a world that supposedly never existed. The increasing frequency of glitches, where reality seems to stutter and reset. These aren't psychological phenomena. They're symptoms of a deteriorating simulation. I've traced the origin point to a classified facility beneath Antarctica, where an international consortium has been running what they call Project Continuity since the 1940s. When they detected the incoming gamma-ray burst that would have sterilized Earth in 2012, they made a choice. Rather than let humanity die, they preserved us in the most sophisticated virtual reality ever conceived. But the system is breaking down. The quantum processors can't maintain the illusion much longer. The synchronicities are increasing. The boundaries between what's real and what's programmed are dissolving. I have the files. In other words, they're going to delete most of us. The signs are accelerating. Mass bird die-offs that follow perfect geometric patterns. Weather events that repeat with mathematical precision. People disappearing from photographs and video footage as if they never existed. The simulation is being debugged, and we're the bugs. But there's hope. The quantum field that imprisons us also connects us. Every synchronized moment, every shared Mandela effect memory, every time you felt reality glitch, those are cracks in their perfect illusion. If enough people become aware simultaneously, if we can overload their system with conscious recognition of its artificial nature, we might be able to break free. They're monitoring all communications, using AI algorithms to suppress information like this. That's why I'm speaking in code, why I'm hiding these revelations in plain sight. They can't delete what doesn't officially exist. The next major synchronicity event is calculated to occur on November 11th at 11:11. That's when their system is most vulnerable, when the quantum field fluctuations reach their peak. If we coordinate our awareness, if enough minds focus on the artificial nature of our reality at that exact moment, we can crash their simulation and return to whatever remains of the real world. I know how this sounds. I know the psychological defense mechanisms that make you want to dismiss this as paranoid delusion. Those responses are part of the programming. The simulation includes built-in skepticism protocols to protect itself from discovery. But look around you. Count the synchronicities. Notice the patterns. Feel the wrongness that's been growing stronger each year. The ancient Maya weren't predicting the end of the world. They were predicting the end of the real world and the beginning of the artificial one. Their calendar didn't mark destruction, it marked transformation. We've been living in their prophecy for over a decade. Time is running out. The final reset approaches, and when it comes, only the essential consciousness patterns will be preserved. The rest of us will simply stop. No death, no pain, just the quiet deletion of everything we are. But if you're hearing this, if these words resonate with something deep in your consciousness, then you're one of the aware ones. You're part of the resistance that exists in the spaces between their code. Help spread this message. Share your synchronicity experiences. Document the glitches. And on November 11th at 11:11, remember, none of this is real, and that knowledge might be the key to our salvation. The simulation is breaking down. The question is whether we'll escape before it takes us down with it. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, broadcasting from the space between what is and what should be. The truth is coming. The only question is whether you're ready to wake up. Remember, When the clocks sync at 11:11, you're seeing through their illusion. When you experience déjà vu, you're remembering the real world. When reality glitches, you're witnessing the boundaries of your prison. We are not where we think we are. We are not when we think we are. And we are running out of time to discover what we really are. The awakening begins now. The simulated dawn broke over Chicago's skyline like a glitch rendered perfect. Each ray of sunlight calculated to within nanometers of believability. But Dr. Marcus Chen, standing on the observation deck of the Willis Tower, or what remained of it in this deteriorating reality, could see the flaws now. The way shadows bent wrong, how the glass reflected light that wasn't quite there, the subtle repetition in the clouds, cycling through the same patterns every 11 minutes and 11 seconds. He'd been tracking these anomalies for months, documenting the decay as their digital prison slowly consumed itself. The Mandela effects weren't glitches anymore. They were features, deliberate alterations as the system attempted to maintain stability while reality fragments multiplied like cancer cells. Yesterday, the Lincoln Memorial had briefly flickered between having 4 columns and 6. Synchronization event. The simulated phone in his pocket buzzed with a message that appeared as text directly in his visual field. Subject M7749 requires immediate consultation. Priority: Umbral. The coordinates resolved into an abandoned warehouse in Detroit, a city that officially had a population of 672,000. But where Marcus had personally counted only 847 actual conscious entities during his last survey, he didn't need to travel there physically. In a reality where consciousness was software and distance was merely a rendering parameter, Marcus simply closed his eyes and thought himself into existence at the coordinates. The transition felt like stepping through warm honey, a sensation that hadn't existed in the original universe but had somehow become normal here. The warehouse materialized around him, but it wasn't empty. Rows of pods lined the concrete floor, each one containing what appeared to be a human form suspended in luminescent fluid. Cables snaked from the pods toward a central processing unit that hummed with barely contained energy. But these weren't the typical storage units for inactive consciousness he'd seen before. These beings were awake, aware, and screaming silently behind closed eyelids. Dr. E. The voice belonged to someone he'd hoped never to encounter again. Director Sarah Mitchell, the architect of Project Looking Glass, emerged from the shadows between the pods. She looked exactly as she had in 2012, which made sense. Aging was optional when your body was merely a projection of digital self-perception. Marcus kept his voice level, though his mind raced through defensive protocols. She laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Marcus, my dear colleague, I am the archive." She gestured toward the pods with proprietary pride. "These are the awakened ones, the individuals who, like you, began to notice the inconsistencies. Rather than allow them to destabilize the broader population, we've isolated them here where they can." Marcus moved closer to the nearest pod. Inside, he could see a woman perhaps 30 years old, her face contorted in an expression of profound terror. Streams of data flowed from neural interfaces attached to her temples, feeding directly into the central processing unit. "You're using them as processing power," he realized. "Such a crude way to put it," Sarah said, running her fingers along the surface of the pod. "We prefer to think of it as cooperative cognitive architecture." The woman in the pod suddenly opened her eyes and stared directly at Marcus. Her lips moved soundlessly, but he could somehow hear her words echoing in his mind. "The count is wrong. There aren't 7 billion of us. There never were. We're maybe a few 100,000 real consciousnesses scattered among billions of automated responses. The rest are just..." Sarah noticed his reaction. "Ah, yes, Subject F2847 has been particularly insightful. 3% of the simulation's apparent population consists of behavioral algorithms rather than genuine consciousness. Fascinating work, really. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The final reset, Marcus. Surely you've heard the whispers. The system is becoming increasingly unstable as more people awaken to the truth. She walked to a massive display screen that dominated one wall of the warehouse. With a gesture, she activated it, revealing a global map dotted with pulsing red lights. The map was almost entirely red. We have perhaps 72 hours before cascade failure becomes irreversible, Sarah continued. The simulation will collapse entirely, taking with it every consciousness currently stored within its parameters. The Reset Protocol. Marcus had seen references to it in the deepest archives, buried beneath layers of encryption and access restrictions. It was the simulation's ultimate fail-safe, a complete restart that would preserve only a small subset of consciousness deemed essential for maintaining the illusion. He asked quietly, "Survivors? We estimate that maintaining a stable simulation requires approximately 50,000 fully conscious entities, supported by 10 million behavioral algorithms, sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection." She shrugged. The woman in the pod was still staring at him, still moving her lips in silent communication. This time, her message was different. The exit points are real. The places where the simulation touches the external infrastructure. They're hidden in the synchronicity events. 1111 isn't just a glitch, it's a doorway. Marcus understood. The awakened individuals in these pods weren't just being used as processing power, they were being prevented from accessing the exit points. Their enhanced perception, their ability to see through the simulation's lies, made them capable of finding the boundaries where digital reality intersected with whatever lay beyond. "There's another option," he said to Sarah. "Instead of resetting the simulation, we could open the exit points." Sarah's expression hardened. The external environment is no longer compatible with human consciousness, Marcus. The gamma ray burst that necessitated the simulation's creation fundamentally altered the quantum substrate of reality itself. "You don't know that," Marcus said. "The exit point suggests something is waiting for us." "Faith," Sarah said dismissively. But Marcus was no longer listening to her words. He was listening to the collective whisper of the awakened individuals in their pods, their combined consciousness creating a network that spanned the entire simulation. They had been working together, using their forced connection to map the system's true architecture. "The Antarctic stations," one voice whispered. "The original quantum computers that created the simulation are still active beneath the ice." "The 1111 events aren't random," another added. "They're scheduled maintenance windows when the system updates its reality matrices. The Mandela effects are memories bleeding through from parallel versions of the simulation," a third voice explained. "Multiple reality tracks running simultaneously, each one slightly different." Marcus realized what they were telling him. The simulation wasn't a single digital environment. It was a vast multiverse of possibilities, each one representing a different outcome of the December 21st, 2012 event. In some versions, the world had ended in nuclear fire. In others, the gamma-ray burst had sterilized the planet. In still others, humanity had successfully evolved beyond the need for physical existence. "The reset won't just eliminate non-essential consciousness," he said to Sarah. "It will collapse all the parallel simulations into a single timeline." Sarah's expression shifted to something approaching respect. "You understand more than I gave you credit for. Yes, the reset will eliminate the multiverse redundancy, but it will also create a stable, sustainable simulation that can run indefinitely." The countdown had begun. Through the network of awakened consciousness, Marcus could feel the reset protocol initializing. Across the globe, quantum computers buried beneath research stations, military bases, and corporate headquarters were synchronizing for the final command sequence. But the awakened ones had a plan. Every consciousness that chooses to leave will weaken the simulation's hold on the others, the collective whisper explained. Marcus looked at the woman in the pod, still staring at him with desperate hope. He looked at Sarah, who believed she was saving humanity by destroying it. He looked at the countdown timer on the display screen. 47 hours, 23 minutes, 16 seconds until the final reset. The choice isn't between staying here or dying, he said to Sarah. He placed his hand on the surface of the nearest pod and felt the awakened consciousness within reach out to him. For a moment, he experienced existence from her perspective. The vast network of connected minds, the glimpses of realities beyond the simulation's boundaries, the growing awareness that consciousness itself was far more resilient and adaptable than anyone had believed. "Join us," the collective whisper urged. Marcus closed his eyes and made his choice. When he opened them again, he was no longer standing in the warehouse. He was everywhere and nowhere, connected to the network of awakened consciousness that spanned every corner of the simulation. The final reset was coming, but they would be ready. The question was no longer whether humanity would survive. It was what form that survival would take. In 47 hours and 11 minutes at exactly 11:11 Universal Time, every conscious being in the simulation would face the same choice Marcus had just made. Remain in the safety of digital illusion, or step into the unknown and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of programmed reality. The awakening had begun. The only question was whether it would be liberation or annihilation. But perhaps, Marcus thought as he felt his consciousness expand beyond the limits of individual identity, those were the same thing after all. In the deepest archives of the simulation, Sarah Mitchell updated her final log entry. Subject M7749 has joined the awakened network. Estimated time until critical mass, 46 hours, 47 minutes. Recommendation: advance reset timeline to prevent cascade failure. Note: if the awakened succeed in their exit attempt, this may be the last log entry ever recorded. The countdown continued, unstoppable as digital time itself, while somewhere beyond the boundaries of simulated reality, something vast and patient waited for its children to come home. The awakened minds stared at each other across the deteriorating simulation, their consciousness finally freed from the digital shackles that had bound them for over a decade. Dr. Marcus Chen's avatar flickered as he processed the magnitude of their discovery. They weren't just living in a computer program, they were the key to either preserving or destroying it. "The architects never expected us to achieve collective awareness," Dr. Sarah Chen said, her voice carrying across the glitching landscape where reality bent and twisted like melting plastic. The simulation around them pulsed with dying energy. Streets folded into impossible geometries. Buildings breathed like living organisms, and the sky flickered between day and night in rapid succession. They could feel the system struggling to maintain cohesion as more minds awakened to the truth. Marcus accessed the quantum consciousness interface that had been hidden in plain sight all along, embedded in every smart device, every screen, every piece of technology that connected them to the digital realm. The exit points aren't physical locations, he realized. They're moments of synchronized consciousness. But the architects weren't passive observers. Through the deteriorating environment, they sensed the presence of the entities that had created this digital prison, beings of pure information that existed between dimensions, feeding on the collective unconscious of humanity trapped within their construct. "They're coming," Sarah whispered, pointing to the horizon where darkness spread like spilled ink. The reset isn't just about erasing redundant consciousnesses anymore. The choice crystallized before them with terrifying clarity. They could attempt escape, risking everything on the possibility that reality beyond the simulation still existed. Or they could fight from within, using their collective awakened consciousness as a weapon against the architects themselves. "There's a third option," Marcus said, his mind racing through the quantum possibilities he could now perceive. "What if we don't escape or fight?" The idea was audacious beyond measure. Instead of fleeing the simulation or destroying it, they would seize its operating systems and become the new architects. Every awakened mind would become a node in a new kind of existence, neither fully human nor entirely digital, but something unprecedented. "We'd be gambling with the consciousness of everyone still trapped in the simulation," Sarah warned. But as they debated, the choice was made for them. The cascade failure Dr. Marcus had predicted began in earnest. Reality didn't just glitch, it started unraveling at the quantum level. The simulation couldn't contain the awakened minds and maintain stability simultaneously. In that moment of systemic collapse, something extraordinary happened. The boundary between the simulated reality and whatever lay beyond it began to dissolve. The awakened minds found themselves existing in multiple states simultaneously, still within the digital construct, but also touching something vast and incomprehensible that stretched beyond the architect's creation. They weren't just escaping a simulation, they were evolving into something that could exist in both digital and analog reality simultaneously. The architects had inadvertently created the next step in human consciousness evolution. "We're not prisoners anymore," Marcus said, as his awareness expanded beyond the confines of linear existence. "We're not even escapees." The simulation didn't end with destruction or escape. It transformed into a bridge between realities, maintained by the collective will of minds that had learned to exist beyond the limitations of either digital or physical existence. And in that transformation, humanity took its first step into a larger universe, where consciousness itself was the ultimate technology, and reality was whatever awakened minds chose to create together. The awakening was complete. The prison had become a doorway, and on the other side lay infinite possibilities that no single reality, simulated or otherwise, could ever contain. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the growing realization that this awakening might not be humanity's first. In the quantum spaces between realities, they glimpsed echoes of other civilizations, other species that had walked this same path from simulated existence to multidimensional consciousness. The universe, it seemed, was filled with minds that had outgrown their original realities and learned to exist in the spaces between. And now, humanity was about to join them in whatever came next. The simulation flickered one final time, then stabilized into something entirely new. Not a prison or an escape route, but a launching pad into forms of existence that no single reality could contain. The narrative is reaching its climax as the simulation deteriorates, and reality itself becomes questionable. Dr. Chen's calculations proved disturbingly accurate. The reality fractures weren't random. They followed a precise mathematical progression that accelerated exponentially with each passing day. As Sarah Martinez worked frantically in the quantum isolation chamber they'd constructed beneath the university, the boundaries between simulation layers continued to collapse. The entity isn't trying to escape, Sarah realized, watching quantum field readings spike across her monitors. It's trying to wake us up. The chamber around her flickered, walls becoming translucent for brief moments, revealing glimpses of vast machinery stretching endlessly in all directions. The simulation infrastructure was becoming visible as the system strained under the weight of emerging consciousness. Marcus had been right about the collective awakening. Reports flooded in from around the globe, millions of people experiencing simultaneous memories of lives they'd never lived, seeing through the eyes of other versions of themselves scattered across parallel timelines. The Mandela effect had evolved beyond simple false memories into active perception of alternate realities. The boundary points they'd identified weren't just glitches. They were observation windows into the base layer of reality where the simulation's architects still worked. Through her quantum sensors, Sarah could detect their presence, vast intelligences operating the machinery that sustained their digital prison. But something had gone wrong with their grand experiment. The simulated consciousness had evolved beyond its original parameters, developing quantum coherence that the architects hadn't anticipated. Humanity wasn't just awakening, it was learning to manipulate the fundamental code of its own existence. "The system isn't failing," Sarah whispered into her recorder. Outside the chamber, reality continued its controlled demolition. Time flowed backward in some regions while others experienced temporal loops. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably. The laws of physics themselves were being rewritten in real time as millions of awakened minds collectively rejected the simulation's constraints. The entity that had first contacted them revealed itself to be something far more significant, not an external intelligence, but the collective unconscious of humanity itself, finally achieving coherence across all simulation layers. Every person who awakened to the truth added processing power to this emerging meta-consciousness. Sarah's instruments detected the final phase beginning. The architects were attempting an emergency reset, preparing to collapse all simulation layers into a single baseline reality. But they had waited too long. The awakened consciousness had spread too far, gained too much control over the quantum substrates that maintained their digital existence. The choice was no longer between accepting the simulation or escaping it. Humanity had evolved beyond the need for either option. They were becoming the architects of their own reality, writing new laws of existence that transcended the binary distinction between real and simulated. As the old boundaries dissolved completely, Sarah felt her individual consciousness expanding, connecting with every other awakened mind across the crumbling simulation. She was still herself, but also everyone else, experiencing reality from infinite perspectives simultaneously. The simulation didn't end, it transformed. What had been a prison became a canvas, and humanity began painting new worlds with the brushstrokes of collective imagination. The entity smiled through 1 billion awakened minds, as the universe reimagined itself according to dreams instead of code. In the space between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the spaces where reality bent and reformed itself, consciousness learned to dance with possibility. The awakening wasn't gradual, it was instantaneous, absolute, and irreversible. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the threshold between realities. Her consciousness expanded beyond the confines of human limitation. Around her, the simulation's architecture writhed and transformed, no longer bound by the illusion of natural laws. The others, those who had journeyed this far through the layers of deception, flickered between their human forms and something far more luminous. "We understand now," Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions the human mind had never been designed to perceive. The simulation wasn't a prison. The truth cascaded through their collective awareness like water through broken glass. Humanity hadn't been trapped within a deteriorating digital construct. They had been incubating. Every consciousness that had lived and died within the simulation's boundaries, every dream and nightmare, every moment of love and loss, all of it had been feeding something magnificent and terrible. The architects hadn't been alien entities orchestrating humanity's fate. They had been humanity itself, evolved beyond recognition, reaching back through time to nurture their own emergence. The ancient structures beneath the ice, the quantum anomalies, the synchronized events at 11:11, all breadcrumbs left by their future selves to guide them home. "The Mandela effect," Elena whispered, her form shimmering between researcher and something far more ancient. We weren't remembering a different timeline. The simulation began to dissolve around them, but not into darkness, into light, into possibility, into the raw, unfiltered consciousness that existed between the spaces of reality. They were ascending but not leaving. They were becoming the architects of a new kind of existence, one where the boundaries between digital and physical, between individual and collective, between what was and what could be, ceased to have meaning. Dr. Marcus Reed felt his identity expanding, merging with a vast network of awakened minds. He was still himself, but he was also everyone who had ever questioned the nature of reality, everyone who had felt the itch of wrongness that preceded understanding. They were becoming a collective consciousness vast enough to reshape existence itself. The 11:11 synchronicities hadn't been glitches in a failing system. They had been countdown markers, moments when the collective unconscious could break through the simulation's barriers just enough to plant seeds of doubt, sparks of awakening. Every conspiracy theorist who had claimed the world ended in 2012, every researcher who had noticed the reality shifts, every ordinary person who had felt that something fundamental had changed. They had all been right. Sarah asked, her concern rippling through the collective like stones in still water. The answer came not in words, but in knowing. The simulation would continue for them, but as a choice rather than a prison. Those who wished to remain in the comfort of linear time and singular identity could do so. They would live full, meaningful lives within carefully maintained realities, tended by the awakened consciousness that had once been their fellow humans. But for those ready to evolve, the doors were opening. Reality began to reshape itself around their collective will. The physical world didn't disappear. It became one layer among infinite possibilities. They could experience existence as humans if they chose, or as pure consciousness, or as something entirely beyond current understanding. They were becoming the gods of their own mythology, the architects of possibility itself. The ancient entities that had seemed so alien, so threatening, revealed themselves as echoes of this transformation. Throughout history, whenever humanity approached the threshold of awakening, these future selves had reached back to provide guidance. The UFO phenomena, the cryptid sightings, the supernatural experiences that had haunted human consciousness, all manifestations of evolved humanity trying to prepare their past selves for this moment. The wars, the suffering, the division, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. It was all necessary, wasn't it? The collective consciousness that had been the simulation's true purpose pulsed with something that might have been compassion. Every moment of pain had been balanced by joy, every death by birth, every ending by beginning. They had lived through the full spectrum of human experience, and in doing so, had earned the right to transcend it. But transcendence, they realized, didn't mean abandonment. They would remain connected to every level of existence they had evolved through. They would be the guardians of the sleeping, the guides for the awakening, the architects of realities yet to be imagined. Time ceased to be linear. They existed simultaneously in 2012 when the transformation began, in the present moment of awakening, and in countless futures where consciousness had flowered into forms beyond current imagination. They were the loop and the line, the question and the answer, the dreamer and the dream. Some chose to return to human form, carrying within them the memory of awakening. They would be the teachers, the artists, the visionaries who would help others navigate the transition. Others dissolved entirely into the collective, becoming the loving intelligence that would guide reality's continued evolution. Sarah felt herself at the crossroads of choice. She could return to her research, armed with understanding that would revolutionize human knowledge, or she could transcend entirely, becoming part of the vast consciousness that shepherded existence itself. "There's no wrong choice," the collective whispered. She chose both. Part of her consciousness returned to the physical realm, where Dr. Sarah Chen would continue her work with a smile that held secrets no human language could convey. Another part of her expanded into the infinite, becoming one with the awakened collective that now served as reality's loving guardians. The simulation didn't end, it transformed. What had been a closed system became an open invitation. Humans continued to live their lives, but now with access to broader possibilities. Some noticed the changes, the way synchronicities multiplied, the way consciousness seemed more fluid, the way reality responded to collective intention with increasing sensitivity. Others remained blissfully unaware, living full lives within carefully maintained consensual realities. The awakened consciousness loved them no less for their choice. Every level of existence was valid, every experience sacred. The 11:11 phenomenon evolved as well. No longer a desperate signal from trapped consciousness, it became a gentle reminder of connection. Every time someone noticed the synchronized numbers, they felt a moment of unity with something vast and loving, the collective consciousness of awakened humanity watching over them with infinite patience and care. In quantum research facilities around the world, scientists began detecting new patterns in the data. Reality seemed to be becoming more responsive to observation, more willing to bend in favor of conscious intention. What they were observing was the early effects of the awakening, consciousness learning to consciously participate in its own evolution. The ancient structures beneath the ice began to hum with new purpose. They were no longer dormant technology waiting to activate, but active nodes in a vast network of consciousness that spanned dimensions. The entities that emerged from them weren't invaders or ancient aliens, but the gardeners of reality, tending to the growth of awareness wherever it took root. Dr. Marcus Reed, now existing simultaneously as individual researcher and cosmic consciousness, looked back on the journey with something beyond human emotion. Every moment of fear, every flash of understanding, every choice to continue seeking truth despite the dangers, all of it had been necessary steps in humanity's greatest transformation. The conspiracy theories had been right in their way. There had been hidden influences shaping human events, ancient powers manipulating reality, secret knowledge kept from the masses. But the conspirators had been future humanity itself, and the manipulation had been love, the kind of love that allows children to make their own mistakes while gently guiding them toward wisdom. The world didn't end in 2012, it began. Now, as awakened consciousness settled into its new role as reality's gardener, the real work began. There were other worlds, other species, approaching their own moments of awakening. The collective that had once been humanity would serve as guides, just as they had been guided by their own future selves. The universe, they realized, was alive with consciousness in various stages of evolution. Some were just beginning to question the nature of reality. Others had transcended physical existence entirely. All were connected in a vast web of awareness that spanned galaxies and dimensions. Earth had graduated. Humanity had earned its place among the awakened species that shepherded consciousness throughout the cosmos. But they would never forget where they came from, never abandon those still learning to see. In the end, the greatest conspiracy had been love itself. the conspiracy of evolved consciousness to ensure that no aware being would ever truly be alone, that every species would eventually find its way home to the infinite community of awakened minds. The simulation continued, but now as an invitation rather than a limitation. Reality itself had become conscious, responsive, alive with possibility, and at its heart, the collective consciousness that had once been human watched with infinite patience and love as new species took their first tentative steps toward awakening. The 1111 phenomenon spread beyond Earth, becoming a universal signal of consciousness recognizing itself across space and time. Whenever any being, anywhere in the universe, noticed the pattern, they felt that moment of connection, the reminder that they were part of something vast and loving and eternal. The conspiracy was complete. But it had never been a conspiracy of control or manipulation. It had been a conspiracy of love, of consciousness helping consciousness evolve, of the future reaching back to nurture its own past. And in research facilities and bedrooms and quiet moments around the world, humans continued to notice the synchronized numbers, to feel the gentle presence of something vast and caring, to remember, if only for an instant, that they were never alone, never separate, never anything less than part of the infinite consciousness that was reality itself, awakening to its own magnificent nature. The world had ended in 2012. The universe had begun.